Hello and welcome to this edition of C++ for Absolute Beginners. Today we're going to be talking about data types and declaring variables. The thing about programming is that we have memory in our computer that we can use so that we can store data. And here's a crude representation of a piece of our computer memory. So in this memory we can store different types of data like numbers, letters, sentences, and a lot of other stuff. So how do we store this data using C++? That's what we're going to learn today. So if you haven't already, let's go ahead and start up Visual Studio. And we're just going to open up the project that we worked on last time. So go to Open Project Solution. I saved mine as Tutorial 1. And then just click on this file here. It's a Visual Studio file. Okay, and there it is, our Hello World program. Okay, so let's get started by deleting everything in the main function. So the 2 lines of output. Now, say I want to add 2 numbers, 2 and 5 for example. I could add them and display the result by putting them in one cout statement. So cout, and then our insertion operator. 2 plus 5, and then another insertion operator, and ENDL. Now, you haven't seen this ENDL yet, probably, because we didn't talk about it in the previous video, but this has to do with the IOStream preprocessor directive. It comes from that file, and what it allows us to do is print a new line, or a carriage return. So let's go ahead and look at this line. So cout, we want to print something. Insertion operator, remember we have to have that right after cout. 2 plus 5 because we want to display the result of 2 plus 5, which is 7. And we have this other insertion operator. Now we have to have that this second insertion operator because it's dealing with formatting. The formatting being that we want to print a new line, ENDL, after the result. So let's go ahead and execute this code, and we should see 7. And it's going to compile. It succeeded. And yep, as you can see, we have the number 7 on its own line. So that's one way of displaying an expression. Now, instead of having all of that in one cout statement, what if I want to store the expression in memory in our computer? If I want to store it in memory, I have to declare a variable. But in order to declare a variable, we need to know data types. What a data type says is the kind of data we're storing. There are many data types, but the 4 that we will be using the most in these tutorials are string, integer, floating point, and character. Strings are for sentences like hello world. Integer, abbreviated int in C++, stores whole numbers. Floating point, abbreviated float, stores numbers containing decimal points, and characters, abbreviated char, stores letters. So let's look at the convention for declaring a variable. We want to store the result of 2 plus 5. So we know that the result is going to be 7, which is an integer. So the first thing we need to do when declaring a variable is to say what data type it is, which in this case is going to be integer. And remember that integer is abbreviated int in C++. So int and then space, and also notice how it changed color there because we're specifying the data type there. And the next step is to give our variable a name. So we can pretty much call it whatever we want with a few exceptions, which I'll go over later on in this video. So for right now, let's just call it result. And the next step is to assign 2 plus 5 to the result. So I'm going to do equal. Now, this is the assignment operator. This doesn't mean is equal to. In C++, we want to use this to assign different things to different variables. So we want to have 2 and plus 5. And don't forget your semicolon. And there we go. So now we're going to take 2 plus 5, and it's going to be evaluated, and we're going to get 7. And with this assignment operator here, right here, it's going to be assigned to result, which is of integer type. So instead of having this cout 2 plus 5, let's go ahead and change that to result. Okay, and let's go ahead and execute that to see if we get 7. And it succeeded. And there we go. We got 7, and then again that end of line. And so that's how to store, that's the basics of how to declare a variable and how to assign something to it. Okay, so now say I want to do division. So all we have to do is just change that to 2 divided by 5. Now, let's go ahead and execute this and see what it gives us. And as you can see, it gave us 0. Now, the thing about C++ is that we're trying to divide 2 by 5 and store it into an integer. So this 2 divided by 5, that's going to give us a decimal point. And it's going to be something like 0. Blah, blah, blah. And so what's happening is because we're storing this in an integer, integer doesn't store decimal points. Floating point does. So all that's happening is we're just getting the 0. Everything after the decimal point is being what's called truncated or just pretty much chopped off. So we're only getting that 0 stored into result. So if we change this int to float, we should be able to get the full decimal point value. All right, and let's go ahead and execute it. And you'll notice that we still get 0. Now, we changed it to float, so you would think that we would go ahead and get the decimal point. But something else that we have to explicitly say in C++ is we have to put the decimal point in one of these numbers. Which one, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to do it in the number 2. But we have to say, hey, well, this is a floating point number because it has the decimal there. And so we're taking an integer and dividing it into a floating point, which is going to result in a floating point. Same if we were to have 5.0 going into 2. It would still result in a floating point. So just remember that. We have to explicitly make one of these numbers a decimal number. So let's go ahead and execute that. And there we go. We get 0.4. Now, something else to mention is that we don't have to have all this on one line. We could say something like result. We can declare the variable result on one line and do a semicolon, and then on the next line we could also say result is equal to the expression. So there we go, and that'll still work because we have our declaration of result, which is floating point type, right here, and then we're assigning 2 divided by 5 to result on the second line, and then we're outputting it. So that works fine too. Now, I just want to go over 2 more examples before we move on to naming conventions. The 2 other data types that I mentioned were char and string. So let's first go over string. Now, if you remember in our previous video, we output hello world. Well, let's go ahead and store the string hello world into a variable and then print that. So we're going to have a string data type, and then we could go ahead and let's just name that hi. And next we're going to assign hi the value of hello world. Semicolon. And then let's change this, since we don't have result anymore, let's change that to hi. Okay, and let's go ahead and execute that. And it looks like it gave us an error right here. So it's asking us if we want to go ahead and run the last successful version of our program that ran. Let's just click no. So what went wrong here? It looks like we got a little red squiggly line here. Let's go over it. And it's saying that it can't find the insertion operator. So what does this mean? One thing that you'll notice that we did differently here is that we're using a string data type instead of an integer or floating point, and now it's giving us an error. Well, this kind of has to do with our compiler. Now, I'm used to working with different editors where the compilers actually know how to handle strings, but this one in Visual Studio doesn't seem to. So what we have to do is add another preprocessor directive, a #include, for a file that processes strings and it's going to have how to output them. So let's go ahead and add #include and then string. So there we go. We got our preprocessor directive right there. And you'll notice that that squiggly line went away. So let's go ahead and run it. And there we go. We got hello world. Now, you're probably asking, well, why did we have to do that with string and not, say, integer? I'm not sure the full reason, but I know that it has to do with, the difference between C and C++. There's some differences in the way that they handle strings. So let's go ahead and change this to a character. So we're going to change this to char, because remember, the abbreviation for character is char in C++. Notice how we're getting this the red squiggly line here, and it's saying, well, this isn't equal to character. So what we need to do is change this, and we need one letter. So let's just do B, the letter B. And you'll notice that we're still getting an error here. That's because we're using quotations. If we're going to make a character, we have to use these single quotes here. And as you can see, that fixed it. So whenever you're working with chars, you got to use the single quotes. Whenever you're working with strings, you have to use double quotes. Okay, and it looks like we're all good to go. And let's just go ahead and add something here. I want to add just a literal, what's called a literal. So we're going to go ahead and just say something like a character. And notice how I also had to put the insertion operators in between. We have a literal here, and then we have a variable here. So we have to have that insertion operator in between those. If we don't, then we'll get an error. So let's go ahead and run that. And there we go. We got a character, the literal, and then B, which is our variable that we have B stored into. So those are the basics of declaring a variable and using them. And we're gonna learn more advanced ways of using it. I mean, these are the very basics. But let's move on to the naming conventions of variables. Now in C++, we can use letters and we can use numbers, and we can also use underscores in the name of our variables. But other than that, we can't really use any other symbols. So let's look at a list of both invalid and valid variable names, and these are otherwise known as identifiers. Let's first look at the invalid identifiers. The first one, you can see we have a hashtag at the end of it, and the only symbol we're allowed to use in our identifiers is the underscore. So that's invalid. The second one, it starts off with a number, and we're only allowed to start off with letters, capital or lowercase, or the underscore. So notice how the last one in the valid list, that starts with an underscore, that works. Now the third one in the invalid list, that one uses dashes, so that's invalid. And then the very last one uses spaces. We're not allowed to use spaces in our identifiers, which is why the underscore comes in handy. So look at that third one in the valid list. Say we do want some nice spacing, we can use underscores for that, but we're not allowed to use spaces. Now the other ones in the valid list, you'll notice the first one we have a heading, and the H in that is capitalized. And that's just so it's easier for programmers to read. So you or other programmers looking at your code, it just makes it easier. Also notice in the second one, so we started off with a lowercase, and then the R in rate is capitalized, and we have Y2K after that. So we can use letters, underscores, and numbers in within our identifiers.